You may not believe it, but this is the strangest aurora I've ever seen. It is the result of the influence of a black hole on the sun. And it also causes severe interference with radio signals. Thanks to this, humans can connect and change what happened in the past. It turned out that a few days ago, the protagonist John was a successful police officer, but his life was going through a terrible time. It was hard for him to find a girlfriend. But today he was asked to break up. John felt frustrated because of the blow. What did he do wrong? At this moment, a call came from the radio in the house, and John felt interested. After a few simple exchanges, both sides felt very compatible. Not only did the two live in the same apartment building, but they also liked the same baseball team. Strangely, the match that the other party mentioned was from 30 years ago. The next day, the police received a report that a female skeleton had been found. According to the forensic examination of the scene, the body was related to a murder case 30 years ago. John went around to investigate, but he couldn't find any useful clues. Nearby was a house occupied by an elderly couple. Their son was also a policeman, but he died of illness early 30 years ago. John didn't get anything, so he left the house and then reported to his superior. That night, after John returned home and was about to rest, he heard the radio call again. The other person seemed very excited because John had predicted the outcome of the match. As the two of them talked more and more deeply, an amazing truth was revealed. That person turned out to be John's father, who had died 30 years ago. At first, both sides thought it was a cruel joke. But then John's dad, Frank, accidentally burned his chair. At the same time, John's chair also showed signs of burning. John didn't know what had happened, but he was sure that the other person was his father. It was too late to explain everything, so he warned his father that he would die in a fire the next day. Frank was furious when he heard this. He yelled back and said that this was completely impossible, and then he hung up the phone. The next day, Frank, as a firefighter, quickly discovered something strange. John not only predicted the outcome of the game again, but he also pointed out the fire stations with firefighters. This made Frank feel very suspicious. Could it be that the person on the other end of the radio was really his son in the future? He brought his doubts to the fire scene and bravely rushed in to save people. But after he found the girl trapped in the elevator outside broke down. Holding on, what the hell is going on? Seeing the flames growing more and more intense, Frank could only carry the girl to find another way out. Instinctively, he wanted to choose a path with less fire. But at this moment, he thought of John's warning. He immediately gave up and chose again. He turned around and found a freight slide, not daring to delay any further. He picked up the girl and escaped. Finally, after sliding down to the bottom and falling into the river, they were saved and Frank was not dead. At the same time, John was in a bar thinking about his father, when he suddenly felt a chill. A series of new memories suddenly popped into his head, and he realized that his father hadn't died in the fire. He had lived a safe and happy childhood with him. John was a little confused, so he hurried to tell his friend Gordo. Gordo said that his father hadn't died in the fire. He had died 15 years ago from lung cancer. So when he got home, he quickly flipped through old newspapers. All the signs showed that his father was still alive at that time. At this point, Frank had also come to terms with the truth that the person on the other end of the radio was really his son, because the previous call had no response. He left a message on the chair for his son, who was still alive. John was overjoyed when he saw it. He never thought he would have a father. What caused such an amazing miracle? The cause was the aurora borealis that appeared above the city. They were the result of the influence of a black hole on the sun, and they also caused severe interference with radio signals. This also allowed Frank and his son to have a conversation between space and time. You're an angel who saved me from the clutches of hellfire. Son, am I dreaming? Is this really Dad? It was late at night, and the two fathers and sons still had topics to talk about. Frank told his son to go back to his girlfriend, and John spoiled the outcome of the baseball game 35 years ago. Frank then went to the hospital to visit his wife, who was on duty. Surviving the accident made him cherish everything much more. That visit also led to her wife's surprise discovery that the doctor had misdiagnosed the patient. She quickly stepped forward and saved the patient, but the patient turned out to be a deranged murderer. This put Frank's family in a dangerous situation. Early the next morning, John was sleeping when he had another new memory. He had attended his mother's funeral 30 years ago. When he woke up the next day, he quickly called his mother, but the other end of the line turned into a restaurant. John had a bad feeling and went to his girlfriend to ask about the situation, but the girlfriend said she didn't know him. He hurried to the police station, where John discovered new information. The female skeleton that had been found the day before had been confirmed to be a victim of a serial murder 30 years ago. The murderer was a sadistic pervert who specialized in targeting professional nurses. The original file only showed 3 murders, but now it was 10. What was surprising was that John's mother was one of them. He ran home in a panic. contacting his father and telling him in detail about his mother's impending murder. After a while of discussion, they had a rough understanding of the situation. It was because John had saved his father, that his mother had gone to the hospital to work the night shift, which led to his mother saving the deranged murderer. Originally, only 3 murders should have been enough to end him. But the deranged murderer was allowed to live and killed 3 more people. It seemed that they needed to find a way to catch the murderer. Only then would they be able to save his mother and the other victims. Knowing that the murderers for target would appear at the bar, Frank quickly went to the location and identified the victim, just as the victim took the initiative to talk to Frank. This would make the murderer go home empty-handed. On the other hand, John was checking the files when he discovered that the number of victims had changed to 9. This also meant that Frank had successfully saved a nurse, but he had missed the opportunity to catch the murderer. That night, as John and Frank were discussing their next move, John's mother brought little John into the room. John couldn't hide his excitement and said hello. Then he told his parents the next target of the murder. He detailed the time and place where the victim would be killed. The next day, while in action, Frank was followed by the murderer. After entering the bathroom, he was ambushed. The 2 men started fighting and Frank eventually lost and passed out. At the same time, John was staring intently at the file. He was waiting for the time of the victim's murder. But the time passed by and the time didn't disappear. Clearly, Frank's plan had failed. After returning home, Frank connected to the radio and told his son what had happened. He was still a little worried, because the murderer would find his way here through his driver's license. Hearing this, John suddenly had an idea. He thought that the murderer would have touched his father's wallet and would definitely leave some fingerprints. So Frank took his wallet out of his pocket and then sealed it in a plastic bag before hiding it in a corner. In an instant, John indeed found the wallet from 30 years ago. It worked. Just wait for my good news. Without further delay, John immediately returned to the police station. Very quickly, the police found the information of the murderer. This person was actually a police officer. No wonder he could get away with it. John didn't stop there. He went to the murderer's house to investigate. John found out that he had been here before. It turned out that a few days before the female skeleton was dug up, the nearest household to the body was this house. John noticed that the homeowner was a nurse, and he immediately realized what was happening. The murderer, in order to clear up any suspicion, would not even spare his own mother. John was furious and went to the bar to find the murderer. He directly told the other party that he was the madman who had killed a woman 35 years ago. Then he vowed to bring him to justice. The murderer calmly did not respond. He guessed that John had no concrete evidence. After returning home, John reconnected to the radio. He wanted his father to expose the murderer through the burial site. At this time, Detective Robin came to Frank's house and said that he was involved in a case. It turned out that the murderer had secretly taken the driver's license hidden on the body. After the successful murder, based on Frank's actions last night, Detective Robin believed that he was suspected of the crime. Frank knew that he had been framed by the murderer. He returned home to tell John about this. However, the police thought that he wanted to inform his accomplice, and a scuffle broke out during the dispute. The radio also fell to the ground, and the father and son were cut off from each other. Frank was then taken to the police station and recounted the incident. However, after hearing it, Detective Robin did not believe him at all. In order to prove himself, Frank predicted the outcome of the baseball game that was being broadcast live. These words made Robin furious. He thought that Frank was talking nonsense, and then he directly locked Frank up. Not long after, the murderer, disguised as a police officer, sneaked into the police station. He drew his gun and aimed to kill Frank to silence him. Fortunately, a police officer passed by at this time, and Frank was able to save his life. Guessing that the murderer would come here again, Frank came up with a plan. First, he pulled down the electrical wires on the wall and then poured tea water on the floor. When the murderer returned to the room, Frank threw the electrical wires out of his hand. The murderer, who was not prepared, immediately fell into the trap. He was electrocuted and then passed out on the ground. Frank opened the murderer's ID and found out his address. Then he used a lighter to burn the spray can and successfully activated the fire alarm system in the police station. In a moment, everyone evacuated. Taking advantage of this loophole, Frank escaped from the police station. At this time, Detective Robin was watching the game. He quickly realized that Frank was not lying. The outcome of the game was exactly the same as the prediction. Elsewhere, Frank had snuck into the murderer's house. He wanted to collect some evidence of the crime. After a while of searching, he found the memento of the deceased, but the murderer also ran up with a gun. Frank had no choice but to leave. The murderer was furious and chased Frank out. Not long after they left, the police arrived at the murderer's house. They quickly found the evidence of the crime scattered on the floor. These things also cleared the suspicion against Frank. At the same time, the murderer chased Frank to a dock. Here, The two had a showdown, and he was also stabbed by a steel nail. When Frank escaped to shore, he didn't see the murderer's head pop up. He guessed that the murderer might have been drowned. The police then arrived at the dock to handle the rest, but they did not find the body. At dusk, the news reported that the Aurora Borealis was about to disappear, meaning that there was only one more phone call left. Knowing this news, Frank began to fix the radio. When the radio was repaired, the radio on John's side also automatically recovered, waiting for the two fathers and sons to connect the conversation again. The murderer, who knows when, broke into the house. It turned out that he was not drowned, but had found a way to come back to take revenge. He tied Frank up with a rope. The murderer went upstairs to kill Frank's wife. The situation was very urgent. On the other side, John and the older murderer started to fight. Fortunately, the sound of fighting woke Frank up. At this point, he heard the cries for help coming from upstairs. When Frank aimed his gun at the murderer took little John hostage. On the other side, John was also pinned down by the murderer. The situation on both sides was extremely dangerous. "You're dead, John." The mother's rescue saved little John, but it only made the murderer angrier, taking advantage of the opportunity to attack Frank. He decisively pulled the trigger, and this shot off the murderer's left hand. Based on the principle of the butterfly effect, the murderer who was about to kill John had a change. That's right, 35 years ago, Frank did not die. And then 35 years later, he shot and killed the murderer. At this point, the Aurora Borealis outside had gradually disappeared. The father and son had completely lost contact with time and space. In the end of the movie, John found love again and had a lovely son.